So I did a video just recently that looked at the way in which Marvel Comics in the mid-80s were sort of cross-pollinating various different toy lines in order to advertise them for various different companies, sometimes within the same comic. But I wanted to particularly focus in this video on Spider-Man and Zoids, which didn't start off as Spider-Man and Zoids, which I'm going to show you very shortly. And I got lucky here because I didn't have any of these from my childhood remaining, so I had to go on eBay and I picked up a few little job lots here and there to try and keep the average issue price down, but then I lucked out because somebody was selling their entire collection, a full run of Spider-Man and Zoids in really, really nice condition. And at that point, I only actually needed a handful of issues, ironically, to complete the run, but I did decide to go for it, and what's in front of you now is their full run, which I'm going to use as the sort of exemplar. I won't go through every single issue because there are loads of them, but I am going to sort of flick through and just sort of look at a few things, because Spider-Man and Zoids arrived at a really interesting time because we're in the mid-80s and the Transformers UK comic is, in full swing at this point. You've got Simon Furman, you've got Geoff Sr. doing art, and they come across into Spider-Man and Zoids. But you also have people like Grant Morrison, who are up and coming at this point in time as well. And he also writes for Spider-Man and Zoids. For Zoids, not Spider-Man as well. So this is why it's quite interesting, but if you're from the US, these Zoids may not be that familiar to you, because I know that over in the US they got Robo-Strucks, which were Zoids, basically, but they had different colour schemes and they had different names for each separate Zoid. So it's kind of confusing, I guess, if you're from the States. But as far as I'm aware, the States didn't get their own Zoids comics. So the English Marvel UK comic is, as far as I'm aware, the only comic that actually promoted Zoids and had a Zoid sort of storyline to it back in the 80s. So all the early Zoids lore kind of flows from this point. So this is a nice sort of jumping in point if you're not familiar with Zoids as a franchise. And the other interesting thing about Zoids as a franchise is it's still going. Nearly 40 years later, at the time of recording, you can still buy Zoids. They are still producing new Zoids cartoons. So although they had quite a long hiatus at one point until these new cartoons came back, which I do remember watching strangely and being deeply confused because they were utterly removed from the comic that I'm about to talk to you about, but that's a different story for a different video. But I actually want to step away from this lovely huge pile of, very satisfying pile of ancient comics that I have here, because I want to show you a slightly separate pile of very, very ancient comics. And you might wonder what on earth I'm showing you Secret Wars for. But you see, the pile I had first there was not in fact the full run of Zoids. In fact, this Zoids special that I have on top was on top for a reason, because these issues that are collected in this special do not appear in Spider-Man and Zoids. So you'll see, if you just remember that prologue page, and we'll return to that. So in this issue of Secret Wars from September 1985, what we have is a free inside Zoids comic strip pullout, which is lovely. And this is just a straightforward sort of advertisement for the toys, basically, but it is done in the form of a comic. So already, even though it's not actually, a sort of an established Marvel storyline, it's inside a Marvel comic already. And as you can see, it's nicely illustrated. It's a proper comic. It's not a sort of, cheap attempt at doing it. But this is introducing these European names for the Zoids here, like Hellrunners and Spider Zoids and so on. Because one of the overarching themes behind the comic was that there was a Zoidarian in it called the Neighbour. and he basically gave names to the Zoids as he observed them. So the Zoids here actually call themselves names already. So we've got the Invincible Zerk, we've got the Zoidzilla, who is this chap here. And lots of people remember Zoidzilla. I've actually picked up this little vinyl toy of him recently, completely randomly. But this is actually a representation of him from the 90s, I believe. Slightly mysterious origins, but although it is Zoidzilla, it was going by a different name at that point, and he showed up in the cartoons in the 90s, but that is Zoidzilla. And of course it looks very much like Godzilla. So for me, it was like having sort of Mecha Godzilla, although I never actually had Zoidzilla. I had smaller versions of him, which I've done some videos about already if you want to go and have a look. But this is a starting point then. Now this is Secret Wars issue number 12, September 85. So if we bounce on in time, lo and behold, we have Zoidzilla again on the cover of Secret Wars number 19 in November 85. Now, these were coming out weekly for the American watchers, so we have skipped on 7 issues, but it's only taken us a couple of months to do that. The interesting thing is, a lot of sources say that the Zoids strip began in issue 20, but this is the issue that introduces Zoids into the Secret Wars comic. So if we flick through this one, these are quite hard to find as well in any great number, although you can find them on eBay. I found it was relatively straightforward to find it on eBay. So here you will find a Zoid strip again. So Letter by Starkings, who I think you find quite frequently. And this is the beginnings of the sort of the main Zoids strip. Now the interesting thing here is that this doesn't have the that prologue page that I thought it might have had. But this does seem to be... That's quite interesting actually. I'm going to have to figure out where that prologue page for Zoids then comes from. Because I thought it was going to be the first one here where they started to introduce Zoids. And yet, interestingly, it isn't. So, in any event, from this point on, you find that Secret Wars now states that it features Zoids. So Zoids actually gets picked up as a backup strip to Secret Wars in November 85. So that is interesting. So we move on with number 20, still featuring Zoids. Now I am missing one of these. Some quite graphic covers for the time. We see still featuring Zoids, getting into 1986 nearly, still featuring Zoids. Now number 25 has got Zoids back on the cover there. And that's a clash that is only going to go one way. But already this is a really interesting indication of how the strip is going to develop, because this Zoid is actually a defector. So he used to be a blue Zoid. There aren't any really good guys, bad guys. It's just Zoids fighting each other. And I'll tell you a bit about the history in due course. But this guy is basically a traitor. He's a defector from the blues to the reds. But his storyline is then such that he then defects, in a sense, and is traitorous within his own ranks as a red. So it's not as straightforward as you might think. It's not simply 2 toy lines set up with one toy line set up with a good side and a bad side. It's not really like that. There's actually a third side involved in it as well. So that was quite unusual, because it's not just sort of the evil empire and these rebel alliance. There are actually 3 factions involved. In fact, at one point there were 4 factions involved. But again, I'll come to that. So it was a really quite a complex storyline for what was ostensibly just a strip in support of a toy line. So 26 I don't have. 26 I'm hunting for, but it's quite hard to get at a reasonable price, it seems. And for some bizarre reason, it's available from the States. I have no idea why. It's a UK comic, but it's available in the States, and I can't find it from a UK seller. So it's pretty odd that. So that's sort of an element that I haven't quite figured out yet. So let's return to what was then the main run, and such was the popularity of them that they got their own comic. And interestingly, this is why you sometimes see these referred to as Volume 2. And the reason is simply because they started off in Secret Wars first. So the Secret Wars issues are regarded as Volume 1. And incidentally, you will also see those Secret Wars issues that don't mention Zoids on the front cover, because in America they didn't run the Zoid strip. In American comics at that time, I don't think they tended to have backup strips. We did tend to have backup strips in our bigger A4 comics in the UK. So when I was reading Transformers, there was almost always a backup strip, and in Spider-Man and Zoids, exactly the same is the case. And in fact, over the course of the run, you get Sectors, Fantastic Four, Star Wars, Strike Force Morituri, and you get Secret Wars 2 also featuring in Spider-Man and Zoids as part of the same comic. And Spider-Man and Zoids are in every issue as well. So you've effectively got 3 strips every week to look at. But the American comics are back issues, of course. They're not, because they wouldn't keep up otherwise. So this is where we start. Now, I love the fact that someone has in case you're wondering what this is a very, very neat incision to get a sticker off that came with the first issue. So that's why there's a nice rectangular gap in my front cover here. I am sourcing one that does have the sticker on it still, so I will have a neater version of this from my own collection. But it's just a little, it's a nice indication of how well these were looked after, the fact that was just cut out very, very neatly like that, which I quite like. So we start off with Zoidzilla being assaulted, and there's this mention of a Prince of Darkness, and this is a guy called Krark, and this is where the third faction comes into it, because some humans have been struck in their ship on the way to the planet, and they've crash landed, and I think it was actually Krark that hit their ship as he was coming in. Because there's a moon of the planet Zoidstar, which is where they're stranded now, which is the production factory for the red Zoids, because it's got very harsh conditions. They had to change their Zoids in order to survive on the moon. So every now and again, new red Zoids come down from this moon. Normally the red Zoids just go up against the blue Zoids because they're locked in this sort of cycle of combat, which their creators, the Zoidarians, programmed into the androids that control the machines. So the machines themselves are not sentient. They're not robots. They're just machines, but they're piloted by android pilots who do have minds of their own up to a point. And I guess the idea is that the leaders of the factions have more sophisticated androids which allow them greater freedom of thought and action. So this is typical of the sort of the artwork that you get, which is classic sort of just the mid-80s kind of fare. But what I really like was just the attention to detail is really, really high. They look like the toys they're supposed to look like. They haven't taken shortcuts in terms of the actual the detail of it at all, which is brave of them, because it must have meant that it took quite a while to produce each issue. And you see here, obviously, blatant toy ad for Zoids there. But again, it just gives you a reminder that they are going very, very closely to the toys, which is admirable, as I say, because the toys are terrific, because they were construction toys. The big ones had batteries, the little ones have wind-up motors, and I've shown you some on another video. But just the sheer detailing that was involved with them was immense. Done by Tomi Takara, and so we got most of them, I think, one way or another here. We got some that Japan didn't get. So we've got all these sort of extra bits and pieces here from the Spider-Man universe. We've got Felicia Hardy, who is the Black Cat, and then we get into the Spider-Man strips afterwards. And I really love these strips because these are the versions of Spider-Man that I grew up with, very much so. But then all of a sudden, you see, we get Sectors. Now, I never had Sectors toys, but I understand there are people who do collect them. They were actually like sort of puppets, so you could put your hand into the toys to manipulate the toys. So you wore them like gloves. So it's very, very clever. But the last thing I expected to find was a Sex Dolls comic strip in Spider-Man and Zoids. But lo and behold, that's where it is. And of course, we also get Secret Wars 2 being advertised here, which is ironic given that Secret Wars was only a few weeks ago in this particular timeline. And so we carry on in a very similar vein. And what you get over the course of the comic is various sort of call-outs to things like the Terminator, to Aliens even, in terms of some of the themes that get picked up. And here they're still just kind of building the general storyline, but you can see that the humans have to contend with these Zoids, which are basically easily capable of overpowering them and killing all of them, but they do take them on, and over time, with the help of the Namer, who is this cloaked guy here, they do actually work their way up and actually take over some of the Zoids, which happily they can fit into the cockpits of and steer. And then they can at least hold their own against some of the Zoids that they periodically encounter. But in the midst of all this, there's this power struggle going on between the blue and the red Zoids. And we see this guy here is called Gore, and he'll come into the strip later on, but he's there to back up this guy, Zoidzilla, because, of course, the Zoidzilla has just lost the Mammoth, which is that elephant Zord that I showed you a few moments ago, because he defected. So he now needs a new lieutenant. So more Spider-Man there. But this is the sort of thing I really love about the comic. This is why I got into it. Originally, I was only trying to buy a few issues worth of it to show you a particular storyline. But as I got some examples, it reminded me of just what a great snapshot in time this comic is. So here you see, you've got the Transformers comic being advertised, and that is what Optimus Prime looked like back in the mid-80s in the comic. That was how he was drawn. And that is the classic G1 Optimus Prime. Those, for me, they form the sort of Transformers backstory for me from my childhood, because that was G1 Transformers comic in the UK. Arguably was better than the US version. So, your mileage may vary, obviously, but that was what I grew up with, and I think they were well written by Furman back then, and really nicely illustrated a lot of the time as well. So, it was a really good, solid comic. Obviously, Zoids don't get the front cover all the time. We get Spider-Man on the front cover a fair bit as well. And the Zoids strips can be quite small. The other thing I should say about the Zoids strips is that they've never been collected. There were collections at the time, which is that first book that I showed you with Zoidzilla on the front cover. But they haven't been collected since. So what I've got in my hands now is the only way in which you can look at the comic in paper, although there is Zoidstar.com, which has been going for donkey's years. And it has scans of all the Zoid strips in it. But what it doesn't do is actually reproduce these comics in full. And you wouldn't really expect it to, because obviously it's focused on the Zoids element. But what I like is, as I say, these sorts of adverts, which do take you right back if you were a kid in that sort of era, and things like this as well. So winning Omnibot 2000 in the Zoids What Happened Next competition. Go to your nearest W.H. Smith toy department, see the first new Zoids, and pick up your competition entry form. But hurry, in the Zoids Awards, he who hesitates is lost. That's the Namer. So again, it's just this lovely sort of example of the way in which things were advertised in the mid-80s. And I know a certain individual from the Leicester Vintage Toy Shop likes these Tomy bots. That was the Omnibot 2000 there, yeah. Exclusive to W.H. Smith, no less, as well, back in the day. So it's great. It's just lovely to see these sort of adverts, and they do take me straight back. It's a strange thing that an advert should do that, isn't it? But now you see, again, this photography work, that is the toy, but they clearly had a really clever guy doing this advertising for them, marketing for them, because this was a great big sort of sweep of, you can see Krarks in the background there, and Zayton, I think, there. but they've put that together. But it's just a photography on a clever background and a clever sort of set. But the fact that some people in the letters pages I noticed as I was flicking through actually complained that they were using actual photographs of toys as the front cover for the magazine. But in fairness, it's great. I mean, the toys look superb. So I don't blame them for doing it, but I suppose I can see from a comics point of view why you might not want that done, you know? So it's quite funny seeing that in the letters section. What I'm just looking for, I'm just having a quick glance there. No one interesting as well. I'm saying no one interesting. That's a bit harsh, but no one massively well known is showing up yet. But again, we've got a nice sort of gore fact file there, which is again another sort of nice reason to actually have the physical magazine, because you were getting all these little sort of extras, and it's just. I mean, I guess it's hard to know what sort of impact this actually had on the sales of the toys. But for someone like me who was into reading and into comics, having this as a sort of a background for the toys would probably have made me want to buy more of the toys. I think there's no two ways about it. It's funny that Krark's just sort of lurking there saying Krark. He does speak, he doesn't just say Krark all the time. And is this? Oh no, it's not yet. Interestingly, this doesn't actually say who drew this issue, which is unusual. Maybe it says it on. No, it doesn't. I'm really surprised at that. Actually, normally there's a strip down the bottom here that says sort of who's produced it, but it doesn't say it there. Let me fast forward. So Fantastic Four are now in it, randomly. This is it. All these sort of random strips are just coming in. We've got sort of big Krark spread at the back there. Let me just see if there are any other interesting adverts in this one to show you. Otherwise I shall move on. Yeah, it's just sort of Fantastic Four stuff. Got a Daily Bugle segment in it as well. Now that, I think, might be a Geoff Senior cover. It looks like him. I don't know if it mentions who does the covers, actually. Yeah, Geoff. So here we are. So pencils by Geoff Senior. So we're into issue number 6, and it's Geoff Senior now doing pencils. And this is the sort of thing. I couldn't swear to you that this is the first time I saw his work, but I remember the strip that he did in the Spider-Man and not Spider-Man and Zoids. I always get this wrong. It's just the Zoids annual, which again I've done a separate video on. But his work in the Zoids annual I've always remembered really keenly, because there's a really sort of critical storyline that happens just in the annual, and it gets referenced from the various issues here as well quite a lot, because it's quite important. So this is the story of how they crash. So basically, the Namer crashed on the blue moon of Zoidstar, and the androids rescued him from the wreckage and gave him this sort of metallic exoskeleton armour to try and protect him in part from the cola thing, but also to let him heal. But in order for the Zoids to work at these low temperatures, they had to modify them to make them more resilient to extremes of temperature. This is what turned them red. So originally here you can see that the spine back was technically a blue Zoid originally, but then once it got modified and mutated, it turns into a red Zoid. So it's just an interesting sort of depth to the storyline, which you wouldn't necessarily expect to get just to sort of have, to back up a toys. But this run ran for 51 issues. So they had to keep it going for a full year. So they had to have something plotted out to keep themselves going. So these two are actually Krark's lieutenants, basically. And interestingly, you don't see more than one of them. So these are actually kind of like individual Zoids, in the sense that they don't get reproduced. So it's quite strange in that sense, because you don't really see any other Zoids where that applies to. We've got a nice sort of technical breakdown of Red Horn the Terrible there, who leads the normal sort of mutated red Zoids. We've got Spider-Man and Puma there, battling it out. He was in quite a few issues. I remember him quite distinctly, because he was a bloke who actually morphed into that sort of Puma character. So he's not a very mainstream Marvel hero, but he's probably one of those ones that they could just pull out of the woodwork at any given point in time for in one of the series, you know. Still in the Omnibot 2000 giveaway competition. Oh gosh. So I mean, there's loads and loads of comics. So I think what I'll do is I'll just skip on. Let me just show you the some of the sort of the front covers as I bounce through, and if I see any really sort of interesting. Yeah, so that's an interesting one. For example, sorry, that's the front cover of 8. But again, this back cover, so that I've already showed you. But just little things like this are Marvel doing 18, Fraggle Rock, Transformers, Secret Wars 2, and the Get Along Gang. It's just such a window onto the sort of the 80s scene. And this is Megatron, and those were Megatron's colours in the comic in the early days for quite a while. It wasn't until much later that he morphed into the more regular G1 Megatron that people are used to, and that is the sort of the way he was represented originally. I'll just have a quick flick through any other. We're still in Fantastic Four in backup strip land there, and in just sort of Zoids adverts and so on. And yep, gorgeous kitten bottom. In terms of so standard sort of artwork people still. So this is where things got quite interesting. That's a very, very intriguing cover. Death kills or does it? Prepare to be astonished. This is where the Terminator kind of storyline comes in, because this chap, spoilers, is actually an android himself, ironically, given that they're on a planet with machines controlled by androids, but he looks human and the crew are unaware of his intentions. So actually it's kind of a mix between Terminator and Alien in that sense. Because basically he gets clobbered by the Zoid, but then he gets up, which obviously he shouldn't be able to do if he's a human, but he ain't human. So that was quite an interesting turn, because I probably wouldn't have seen the Terminator film at the time when I was watching this, or indeed Alien. So that would have been quite a radical plot twist for someone who was young at that point in time. So here you see some of the new Zoids coming in, or the newer Zoids coming in, and you'll see them in the strip already, actually, interestingly. So there's Zazen and Zunder. This one I've done a video of recently, because I've rebought that toy recently, and this one, the Z-Ray. So the reds were quite interesting. A couple of blues there, but the reds always, I felt, had sort of more interesting styling in many ways, because the red Zoids came later. So the more basic blue Zoids that formed the original toy lines in Europe and America weren't represented. Were represented first, but they weren't represented in such sort of interesting designs. Their designs were a lot older, so it wasn't until these red Zoids came in that you started to get them looking a little bit sleeker, basically. And the engines probably got a little bit better as well, as a lot of them were still wind up. So we're into, that's issue 11. Again, still sort of Zoids on the back, so we'll just move on. Volume 11, Spider-Man. And again, books from Marvel, Transformers, Care Bears, Get Along Gang. So, it's all, it's just very cute, isn't it? Because it was a more innocent age. Get Along Gang and Care Bears, and good grief. Love that as well. That's Biggles. Biggles was a big sort of, it was quite a clever film. It involved time travel with Biggles. It was just random, but I have seen it quite recently, actually. I don't know how I saw it, but it was on TV recently, I think. So it just made me smile, because again, it was one of those things that got a lot of advertising, but probably wasn't that brilliant a film when push came to shove. But you also get sort of crocodiles. I mean, what always makes me smile about the Zoids is that they somehow managed to be modelled off Earth animals, even though they're from a different planet. But interestingly, there is a plot twist in the course of the comic which reveals that Zoids did once get as far as Earth, because the Zoidarians were a very warlike race. They liked war, and they did have a big empire at one point. So their empire was very, very widespread. So, if there's one of the underlying risks is that if the Zoids do get together under Krark, Prince of Darkness, and he's trying to unify reds and blues, they could then go out and conquer the entire universe. That's one of the things that the Namer is worried about. This is that's number 12. this is actually, and again, this is another little plot twist. It turns out that somebody else has been to Zoid Star, so another Earth sort of individual had been there, and they almost managed to make contact with her, but she manages to take off before the crashed crew can actually make contact with her, and we then get introduced to the idea that there is an organisation back on Earth that is quite interested in the Zoids, and that the fact that this sort of ship of prisoners was sent down there was no accident. So I mean, there's even a Blake 7 kind of feel to it on that basis. If you want to starting the storyline with a ship full of prisoners, lots and lots of things getting sort of call outs basically in one way or another. If you've got that sort of pop cultureness to you, Spider-Man and Zoids there, the Hobgoblin and Spidey. And now we're getting into Transformers special teams on the backs. I mean, that again takes me back because they were a big deal in the Transformers comics at the time. But of course, not sort of Toby Takara, but not actually that. Still Hasbro. Oh wow, this one's actually got a poster in it still. Cool. That's probably quite unusual to still have that in the comic itself and not taken out. That's volume 13. Some of these volumes were incredibly difficult to find, and that is actually why I jumped on the potential to actually pick up the ones I was missing, because they were really, really hard to find certain issues, and that might be why, because there was a poster in it. This one was quite easy to find. I think I've got several copies of this one actually. So again, pretty sort of standard fare. But this is where he realizes that this guy realizes that he's seen a Zoid in a sort of an Egyptian tomb or a tomb somewhere on Earth, and he twigs that's how far they got. There's another poster still intact as well. I haven't actually looked through all of these individually because obviously there are quite a few of them. I kind of wanted to get on and get this out so you could sort of have a look, and it might it's just a really nice capture of a lot of 80s stuff. And again, this I didn't realise. Spider-Man and Zoids and Star Wars. So it's like, what is this doing here? I mean, it's just, I'd forgotten that the Star Wars comics were Marvel even back then. So it's somewhat ironic it's come full circle so that, Disney owned Marvel, owned Star Wars. It's kind of, it's just funny how these things come around. It turns out that the name isn't the Last Zoidarian. I think originally their skin was green, but they changed them to blue for the comics. And this is the first time that Krark actually starts attacking with blue Zoids that he's sort of convinced to come over to him, and that in turn leads to quite an interesting little storyline, because they just start developing this sort of mythos behind the Zoids far more and beyond the toys basically, because you couldn't get toys of the sort of convict ship or the convicts had crashed and all that sort of stuff, because they were part of the toy line. They were just characters that the comic brought in. So here's our sort of Terminator-esque friend again causing mischief. So he keeps busy. And again, just that sort of that advert for the various different Marvel series that are going at the time. Spider-Man Zoid 17. I'm just moving on because I'm conscious that this is taking quite a while to get to this point. Now, this is where things get very interesting, because Spider-Man and Zoids, issue 18. Grant Morrison. So this is the first time, I believe, that Grant Morrison is involved in the writing of the Zoids, and it's also ironically with Geoff Senior artwork, which is lovely from my point of view. So it's issue 18, this. And as you can see, this is for Zoids. This isn't for Spider-Man, this is for Zoids. And this is really fascinating because in this issue, we're introduced to the idea of wild Zoids. So Zoids that haven't been created by the Zoidarians, but presumably have somehow just kind of developed independently. So this creature is actually a Zoid. And these two little guys are actually trying to find a sort of Zoid afterlife called Metalon. And these are the issues that Grant Morrison initially wrote for. So this is called an Octozoid. So it's an octopus that's a Zoid. But these are not toys. So they just came up with these themselves to bolster the storyline, and introduce this idea that Zoids might believe in an afterlife. And again, all of these Zoids here are not toys. These are just Zoids that they developed that are sort of lying around in a Zoid factory. This is where Silverman pops up again, causing more problems, because you just can't keep a good android down sometimes. So that was the first of the Grant Morrison issues there. And this one's quite easy to find. And again, this is a Grant Morrison issue as well. This concludes that sort of afterlife storyline, and it's still inked by Geoff Senior. And here, good old Transformers, more adverts there coming in. Scourge and Cyclonus. Had Cyclonus, didn't like Scourge so much. I think I might have had Hot Rod, possibly, but not either of the other two. I didn't like their robot forms as much. Cup and Blur. But yeah, so you can see, time's kind of moving on now, and it's just, we're well into the peak of Transformers, and Zoids were up against it as a toy to try and keep up with that. Now I love this. It's quite a violent front cover for a kid's comic, but again, that's Geoff Senior artwork, I believe. And interestingly, given that it's Geoff Senior artwork, Simon Furman is now writing in Spider-Man Zoids. Right there. So that's really, so we've now got quite a few of the experienced Transformers hands coming in to help write and ink this strip, which is predictable because obviously they were sort of part of the backbone of Marvel UK at this point in time. So it's not really a sort of surprising thing to be happening, but I like it because I'm familiar with them as creators. I actually have a cunning plan about commissioning Geoff Senior to do something at one point, because he does take commissions for his artwork right now. So I just keep on bouncing through. So I'll keep on bouncing through. I'll just show you some front covers and the back covers for now, because I don't really have time to go through all of them. So nice sort of Spider-Man front issue. Quite a bit of Venom actually in these Spider-Man issues. There's an interesting issue actually where Venom actually seems to die at one point in here. Obviously he's then sort of brought back, but I was quite surprised when I saw that. That's quite a funny front cover. Griff about to get stomped on by Zoidzilla. That's it. And it's interesting because Zoidzilla probably wasn't that fast, so this Trooper Zoid probably could stay ahead of him. But unfortunately, Griff does get it taken out, and then their ship does actually manage to take off briefly. But unfortunately, the dear old Namer then manages to hijack it for reasons that we're not immediately clear of. But he had been on their side to this point, and then all of a sudden he's pinching their ship as a kingpin. Marvel Superheroes role-playing game. I remember this ad came up a lot when I had when I was buying some US comics from this period of time. I remember that advert came up a lot as well. So I'm not even sure you could actually even get it easily in the UK, but maybe it just sort of bled across. I don't know. So Spider-Man Zoids again, 24, and then this is where we go back to the Blue Moon of Zoidstar, because lo and behold, there are several other Krarks being hatched. So the reason that the Namer pinched the Earth ship was to go back up to the Blue Zoid moon, so that he could try and put at least sort of put a dent in the Red Zoids' ability to reproduce themselves, because the Red Zoids automated factories are still producing Red Zoids, and they arrive on Zoidstar in sort of meteorite shells, a bit like the Transformers did in the new movies. So that's how they sort of get launched down. But the Namer manages to sort of overload them basically and take them out. So that puts an end to that threat. But as they say at the end of the episode, there is always the possibility, of course, that there could be more than one factory up there, which of course there probably is. And now we get into Transformers are still going strong. We're into triple changes now. So this is the original ad for Broadside, Sandstorm, Springer, Astro Train, Octane. I had Astro Train, Blitzwing. Funny enough, I've got a Springer now, but I didn't have him originally. He's not the greatest example of him, but I do have him. He was very cool in the movie, very cool character in the movie. And this is about the time when the annual came out. So from this point forward, the comics actually reference the annual content quite a lot, because the annual did have quite a few sort of establishing facts. Got Geoff Senior's back again on the artwork here. I love those serpent Zoids, but I've never had one. And this is actually, and this feeds back into what I was saying about the annual, because this is Redhorn's pilot. So this is actually the aftermath of Redhorn being taken out in the annual. So it just links together seamlessly, but you do kind of need to have gotten the annual. This is a great advert here. So you've got this anniversary pin-up for Marvel's 25th anniversary. But you've also got this wonderful exclusive to Boots, Zoids v Zoids special offer. Free History of Zoids poster magazine. I nearly got one of these from eBay the other day, but I missed out just. It's yours free with any Zoid you buy. Free Zoid worth £2.45 when you buy either Gorgon, Zoidzilla, Mammoth or Redhorn, who would have been more than £2.45. I had Gorgon. He was a big one. And in fact, I've got another one coming, not of him, but I'll show you that when it arrives. But it hasn't come yet. Hurry to Boots toy department now. Brilliant. It's just great because really proper advertising toy-ins, and only British audiences will understand why I'm sort of amused by that. But Boots is actually a chemist. But it did used to have it still does have a bit of a tiny bit of a toy section as well. So this is interesting. So this is actually where the Venom symbiote seems to get destroyed in this particular back issue of Spider-Man. I think it was from Web of Spider-Man was the sort of the US comic it was taken from. Somebody told me that recently. And there's the Zoids annual being advertised in Spider-Man and Zoids, of course. Nostalgia and Comics advertise themselves, based in Nottingham. Don't know if they're still around. Always possible. And there's the Sectors ad. Ironically, for the first time, I think, despite the fact we're several issues away from when their comic strip was still in it. But there's the Sector ads, and you can see the child's arm going into the sort of the puppet, and then that's how they played with the toys. So it's I say it wasn't a line I ever owned any examples of, but there it is. So there's the Great Gorgon. I think this is when they get their hands on the Great Gorgon. Geoff Senior again, still inking away, bless him. Another Sectors ad there. Learn how to draw comics the Marvel way. Yep, saw a lot of adverts for that down the years, definitely. Lots and lots. Little Hobgoblin. The Target 2006 crowd. The classic, wonderful classified ads bit for various comic shops that probably don't exist anymore. And this was the original. For some reason, they put this little sort of original origins of Spider-Man strip in. It's fascinating that I wonder if it's to do with the anniversary of Marvel, that one, that they dropped that in there, because the Spider-Man strips here, but then they got this as well. So it's quite novel, that. And in fact, it might be one of the few times in this comic where there isn't a third backup strip. So maybe they put that in instead. Just over halfway through. Good lord. So the Spidey cover, that's Redhorn's pilot up there. We haven't got back to. Yes, let me just bounce. Power Machines. I don't know if you remember. I don't remember Power Machines. If they ring any bells for you, but they're now being advertised on the back cover there. This was Redhorn's attempt to get the Red Zoids to follow him, which failed miserably because of course he's not in the right Zoid. They're not impressed by the fact that he's in a Serpent Zoid rather than Redhorn. So that doesn't work out so well for him as a concept. Another Triple Changes advert on the back there. Anything else? Yes. And now Thundercats start getting advertised. So we've had Thundercats, Sectors, Transformers, Power Machines. We've had all sorts, Omnibots, and now we've got Thundercats. So they weren't precious about who they advertised for at all. But again, just a wonderful example of toys which we now consider to be vintage. Just that is how they were advertised back in the day. It makes me smile when I come across things like that because it wasn't at all what I had in mind when I started grabbing these again at all. But it's just really interesting, given that this is sort of a line that I've gone down recently with collecting vintage toys, and it's just it's fascinating to see how they're originally advertised here. So again, we're back to Grant Morrison now. So he's returned to writing duties. It's been a little while since we've seen him or heard from him. This one irks me. This issue, reason being, it's a new editorial crew has taken over with issue 30. Apparently, we're into late '86 now. But look at this. This Hellrunner's got a transparent cockpit. Hellrunners don't have transparent cockpits. That's like a blue Zoid cockpit that's been stuck onto a Hellrunner. So the artwork, for some reason, just skips a beat here. But this is another one where the main character here is actually a sort of a refugee from another planet that's been decimated by the Zoids and the Zoidarian wars. So it's just one of those sort of kind of offbeat strips where it's not focused on the normal human antagonists, and it just takes a completely different line, which is nice. This is an interesting one. It's called Starbrand. You probably wouldn't have heard of it. No reason why you would have done particularly. Part of the new universe, the Marvel New Universe stories that came out in the mid-80s. And strangely enough, I have an American comic of a slightly later story of Starbrand and some of the other people that turn up in his strip. But I didn't remember this being in Zoids at all, because I'm pretty sure the first time I came across him was in a standalone US comic that I completely randomly picked up. So it was really fascinating to see this in there. And again, it might be one of the few places where it was actually ever reprinted. And this will still be, that's still Grant Morrison. But again, it's Grant Morrison and Geoff Senior again, which is nice. Just finishing off that storyline, which I say was different. It was just different. It was one of those quirky little storylines, but which just adds a bit of depth to the, to the comic in terms of its overall kind of quality, which is, is great. So again, more classified ads there. More Starbrand there, and again we're now into Galvatron v Ultra Magnus as the toys. Never had either of these two guys. Didn't like the Galvatron toy at all. Much preferred how he looked in the comics as well, because he looks daft as all heck there. But he was much better in the comics, as was Ultra Magnus, because at that point they weren't afraid of making the comics characters look better than the toys, basically. Whereas ironically in Spider-Man and Zoids, the Zoids always look like the Zoids, albeit they had more versions of them. So issue 32, more the same. Now, interestingly, a Thundercat strip written by Simon Furman. The guy gets around, what can I say? But just sort of really interesting, because it's a full-on little mini strip. It's Snarf narrating, which is irritating. But nevertheless, it's actually, it's not just a single page. It's actually a few pages giving you the background of the Thundercats, and then a slightly more detailed advert than we've seen before for Thundercats. So just really sort of interesting stuff. And again, big Thundercats advert on the back there. And just goes to show just how heavily Spider-Man and Zoids was being used as advertising material. So the readership must have been, they must have been selling it. Maybe more for Spider-Man than Zoids, of course, in fairness, when you think about it. But from my point of view, although I like Spider-Man, I've always liked Spider-Man, but the Zoids element to me was more science fiction driven, and therefore sort of more interesting for me personally. So again, still Zoids, Spider-Man, Starbrand still going. They've sort of redone the intro pages here. Thundercats Annual being advertised there. And Transformers still being advertised on the back there. Clearly Hasbro were Zoids Annual advertised there, and Transformers Annual, which I've got somewhere as well, being advertised there. So they were properly pushing it in terms of hitting us every which way they could with reminders that maybe we'd like some more toys. So issue 34, spring on the back. Issue 35. The covers were great. the actual sort of drawn covers were terrific. There's Power Machine things again, Sectors, Thundercats, Transformers still being pushed there as well. And is that just the dream sequence? Probably. Okay, skip that one. Now, we're approaching the run of the comics that I actually particularly wanted to get. But what I might do now is do a separate video of them, because I've spent so long on this one that it's just going to get lost if I try and do it now. Cybersol, the corporation, and this is a fake Zoid on Earth. They're the corporation that seem to have put everything in motion. Again, Grant Morrison does this strip. And this also reintroduces Silverman properly. And we last saw him in issue 19. But here he is, and this is what he's been making with his spare time whilst he's been away. He was assumed dead, but of course, being an android, he's done a Darth Maul and pulled himself together before Darth Maul was a thing. So he's almost turned himself into a Spider Zoid at this point, and he's been busy. This is the storyline that I'm going to cover in a separate video, because it's called the Black Zoid storyline. And again, it's a really, really interesting extension of the creation of a Zoid mythology, but it has massive repercussions for the crew and for Zoidstar as a whole. So I'm just going to zip on now. So number 37, nothing new on the back. Number 38, Spidey Goes Berserk. Thundercats getting a shout out on the back there. And 39, which I've only just got a separate issue of, actually. Quite an interesting one, because at some point, Haller there has discovered that he's actually partly android himself, for backstory reasons, basically, that we hadn't been aware of before. Again, Marvel superheroes being advertised there. Just see if there's... This strip is quite an interesting strip. Again, this is... I think I remember this. And I've just started rereading it, actually, because it's quite interesting in that people are being sort of upgraded, but it limits their life down to a year, but to try and sort of combat some sort of alien threat to Earth. So quite interesting of its day. Thundercats Zoid annuals again. So this is where things start getting quite dark, actually, and it ends with a bit of a sort of a Thing reference as well. But basically, Silverman has been very, very busy, and that's what he's created. And so he's basically out to get everybody now. Look, Transformers the movie, look at that. Love that. I love Transformers the movie. Probably one of the last cartoon, sort of movies I ever went to see, that one, actually, in terms of that time in my life. It was epic. It was properly epic. Pretty dark, but epic nonetheless. So, yeah, pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, this is Zoidzilla going down there, basically, which was just unheard of in the course of the strip. Okay, more Thundercats. So I'm just going to bounce through now, because I say I'll keep your eyes peeled for a separate video where I look at the Black Zoid saga in more detail. But this issue was now impossible to get. I looked and looked for this one, I could not get it anywhere. So I'm so glad I managed to get it as part of this overall the collection, because otherwise I think I probably would have been completely stuffed. So Thundercats again. Christmas issue. 27th of December 1986. Number 43. So we're getting towards the end of the run now. There aren't many issues left, you'll be glad to know, because I've spent nearly an hour talking now, which is pretty impressive. Just noting, interestingly, it has got a US and a Canadian price tag on it now, although this is clearly a UK comic. And again, very, very interesting, very, very interesting covers at this point in time, as things are kicking off. And that is 45, Sinister Syndicate, starring Silver Sable. Number 46, which is bringing in the epilogue to Secret Wars 2. So quite a few sort of big name Marvel characters there in their 80s style costumes, which, again, is what I grew up with. So when everyone started getting excited about Captain America and people coming onto the big screen, I was like, yeah, whatever, I've seen them before. But not everyone had, apparently. So on sale now, Doctor Who, Transformers the movie. Actually, I've got that not far away. And that Zoid special, very difficult to get. Haven't got it yet, actually. The only one I can see on eBay is actually from America, bizarrely. Spider-Man Zoids 47. Advertising the same thing as the previous issue on the back. Spider-Man Zoids, I like this cover. I think that's a Geoff Senior cover again. It's a Red Zoid Recruit. So this is where the toy line was starting to bring in some new models. So as a result, we had more arrivals from the Blue Moon that Clark meant to meet to recruit them. And indeed, these are they on the front cover there. Clark's Commandos. So Snake, Hellcat and Scarab, I believe. Now Action Force being advertised on the back cover. So it's all interlinked. It's just fascinating because this was you know this is actually 1987 now we're into. So it's quite strange in a sense because I often think of these things as being earlier in the 80s, but they were quite late 80s. Apparently they call him Manslaughter, and Spider-Man now knows why. Now this chap, I can't remember if I ever had him. I think I wanted him, but I'm never sure I actually got him. Zaber. Zillans I liked as well. They were like Trooper Zoids, only more so. But these are all getting towards the end of the original run of Zoids models in the UK. So there's the Hellcat toy, the Snake toy, and the Scarab toy. So you can see there were, the comics were bang on it, and immediately reproducing the new models as they appeared. And finally, the final issue, The Return of Redhorn. And interestingly, you can see straight away, well I can, that they added more spikes to him. So they actually modded him from the original toy version of him. So, there you are. That's all 51 issues of Spider-Man and Zoids. And I've also shown you Secret Wars and Zoids. And some Secret Wars that had Zoids but didn't call themselves Secret Wars and Zoids. So, there are a few other little snippets, and again, you have to go back to zoidstar.com to see them. But there are some unpublished strips that Zoidstar's got, and they've also got captures of some of the other promotional comics that came out, from Tomy themselves to advertise the toys that came out after the comic ended. So if you want the complete set, you'd have to go hunting quite hard at the moment. But those are the ones I wanted to show you because I just think it's a genuinely terrific snapshot of UK Marvel comics from the 1980s and everything else that was going on in toys and everything else at that point in time. And it does take me right back to my childhood looking at all of those. And I had very fond memories of the Zoids. They were terrific toys and they continue to this day, which in quite a low-key way. I mean, I don't think they're big here at all, but I think in Japan they're still very well known. They've had computer games, they've had cartoons, series, they've had mangas. It's still very much alive and kicking, but they've moved a long way from the UK version of the storyline. You have sort of Republic and an Empire battling it out a lot of the time in there. So lots of other videos on YouTube about that side of things, but that was my video on Spider-Man and Zoids, the UK Marvel comic. And with that, do like and subscribe if you are still here, and I shall see you again, and I will be delving into the Black Zoid saga when my voice has recovered. Cheers for now.